Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today, in part 2 of our two-part series, we're digging into the watches of James Bond in the Dalton, Brosnan, and Craig eras. These eras really occur at a pivotal moment for the watch industry, really. If you don't know watch history, the 1980s was a really tumultuous time for the Swiss watch industry in particular, with the advent of battery-powered watches really taking over the watch world by storm and reducing the cost of watch manufacture. The Swiss watch industry, which had built its history and reputation around mechanical watchmaking, was in a peculiar place. And so the 1980s was the real fallout from something called the quartz crisis, right? The rise of the quartz battery-powered wristwatch, which Bond had previously been wearing in the Roger Moore years, starting with the Pulsar introduced in Live and Let Die, but also switching over to Seiko's, which Roger Moore wore up until A View to a Kill. So when Timothy Dalton came back as Bond, he obviously came back with his own level of more tactical personality, and he was introduced in The Living Daylights wearing Tag Heuer. He wore the very cool Night Diver, which is a black watch with a entirely illuminated face. He wears that during the pre-title sequence in The Living Daylights. It's a very cool watch. You don't get a good look at it in the movie, but if you look up pictures of the watch, it's really cool, very tactical. And then he wears essentially a Tag Heuer that is more or less the Tag Heuer version of the Rolex Submariner. Timothy Dalton then switches back over to the Rolex Submariner, returning to the Submariner for the first time since The Man with the Golden Gun in License to Kill. There's not much to be said about the way in which Dalton wears his wristwatches, beyond the fact that it's kind of in the way that Dalton wears everything in his wardrobe and ensemble. It's kind of utilitarian, worn without a lot of fuss and care. He is the embodiment of the Bond ethos in the sense of just pure efficiency. We previously discussed how Bond watches are essentially utilitarian objects. Bond chooses his watches because he wants watches that will perform well as tools. And it's hard to think of another Bond who so embraces that ethos across his entire, wardrobe. Even if you don't love the fashion of the Dalton years, and certainly I don't like nearly any of the fashion in License to Kill, personally speaking, but it is nevertheless true that Dalton feels like he embodies something of the Fleming ethos in regards to watches, especially in the sense that Fleming's Bond, was initially introduced wearing disposable, expendable wristwatches that he could put to use in the field for other means, using them as knuckle dusters, or trading up to the Rolex just because it was such an exceptionally fine tool. You get that sense with Dalton's Bond. He's wearing a very tactical set of watches in The Living Daylights, and then the Rolex Submariner is just an enduring model, especially even at that time, really, of durability. Now, this was also the point at which Rolex had started to transition, into its iconography of kind of like a status watch in the sense of like 1980s glitz and glamour. Notably, the same year License to Kill came out, you had the movie Die Hard, and the way that is treated as a status symbol in that movie, a symbolic vessel of kind of corporate achievement, speaks to the way in which Rolex had evolved over time from this timepiece that was really, for such a long time, advertised as being an explorer's watch, the watch of seasoned professionals, and had started to shift more onto the trajectory that has greatly accelerated in recent years, that has put Rolex firmly in the tier of the sort of luxury brand. By the time Pierce Brosnan was selected to take up the mantle of Bond in GoldenEye. There had been some years of dormancy for the Bond franchise, and the story goes that really EM Productions was talking to two brands in particular for GoldenEye. One was Tag Heuer, again, which potentially could have gotten the Bond license and picked up from the Living Daylights, and that would have been an interesting alternate universe for us. But it was Omega that really lobbied hard to be the watch of James Bond in what was one of the smartest moves Omega could have made. Omega is the flagship brand of the Swatch Group. The Swatch Group was formed as a response to the aforementioned quartz crisis to really consolidate a bunch of Swiss brands that were having financial trouble and kind of set a standard for what the Swiss watch industry could be going forward, especially under the pressure that the very strong Japanese watch market had put on the Swiss. So the Swatch Group is a conglomerate of a number of Swiss watch brands, including, Tissot, Hamilton, and others that kind of all form together into this one giant mega conglomerate. And when Omega lobbied for Bond, they pushed for extra promotional time. They really wanted to be seen as the watch of James Bond. They were the first brand to really take advantage of James Bond as a serious marketing investment. And it's one of the smartest moves Omega ever made, because Omega has a great storied watch history, right? If you look at the development of Omega as a brand, it is certainly full of significant milestones, and at least one really truly iconic watch in the Speedmaster, which was notably the Moon watch, which Omega promotes greatly, and is arguably the greatest chronograph watch ever made, at least in terms of just sheer iconography. But Omega did not have another watch to its name that could really be held up as an icon in the same way. When you look at Rolex, yes, the Submariner is the iconic watch of Rolex, but they also have the day date and the date just. There's a kind of design language that Rolex has, as well as a set of models, the Daytona, the date just, the Submariner, that had created a family of models that were all in their own right iconic and had a pretty storied history. Omega bidding for Bond was their bid to essentially establish a new watch icon, and they worked with costume designer Lindy Hemming to choose the watch, and the watch chosen was the now very iconic Seamaster Professional, which was selected because it really emphasized the naval element of James Bond with those waves on the dial. Even the bracelet, it feels very naval. There's a sense in which the Rolex Submariner, as far as a diving watch goes, was the first to really establish Bond with this idea that he is going to be associated with nautical watches, nautical sports watches in some way, shape, or form. And that association really belongs to the association between Bond and Rolex. But the Omega watch design with the Seamaster Professional really takes that to a new level. The Seamaster Professional feels decidedly naval in design in a way that the Rolex Submariner is a little bit more situationally agnostic. That the Seamaster Professional feels like it is made for nautical activity, as emphasized by the wave dial. I mean, you can't get any clearer than that. I think the Seamaster Professional is very much a watch of its time, but Lord knows, as a young person in the 90s, I thought the Seamaster Professional was the coolest watch I had ever seen, and still, with nostalgia blurring my vision, it still is one of the coolest watches I've ever seen. In the sense that it just seemed so appropriate to this character. I mean, there is a bit of flash in the way that the watch is designed. It's got like a little bit of style, the cutout hands, the more detailed bracelet. It's a little bit dressier than something like a Rolex Submariner, so it seemed to suit Pierce Brosnan's Bond very well, because Pierce Brosnan's Bond has his own sort of elegant flair. I mean, in GoldenEye, after the pre-title sequence, he's introduced wearing, you know, like the neckerchief, essentially, the day cravat. You know, he's given to a little bit of stylistic flair, and it felt appropriate for his character. Now, we do understand pretty clearly across the Brosnan tenure, the watch is meant to be Q branch issued equipment. It's stocked with a laser, as well as many other gadgets across Brosnan's tenure. There's the moment in Tomorrow Never Dies that is very amusing, where he's in Wei Lin's equipment shop, and Wei Lin has her own version of the Omega Seamaster competing with the MI6 variant, and Bond has a line or two about that. So you have that this sense that this watch is truly equipment for Bond. This is not a personal piece. With the Submariner, in the Connery years, it was always unclear whether that was Q branch equipment, at least up until Live and Let Die, or whether it was Bond's personal watch. And even in Live and Let Die, it's unclear whether Q branch has modified Bond's personal Submariner with that gadgetry, because some of the dialogue indicates that might be the case, or whether it is, in fact, just Q branch issued. But the Bond watch in GoldenEye is very clearly Q branch equipment. And what is really great about the Brosnan era is it's the first era to just kind of consistently zero in on Bond wearing a single watch. It really becomes synonymous with Brosnan's Bond, and I think that contributes to the level of the level of sort of totemic power, maybe we might say, that it holds for those of us who have a lot of affection for the Brosnan era. It's an instantly clear symbol of Brosnan's Bond, and that's unique in the series, really. All the prior Bonds kind of jump around with watches and models across their tenure. Even George Lazenby is wearing a few different watches in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So you don't get that strong association between one Bond actor and one particular model in the way that you really do with Pierce Brosnan's Bond. And given that the model just feels very appropriate to his particular version of the character, it's hard to it's really hard to shake the sense that was in any way a misstep. If anything, I kind of wish the series would get back to it. I think Bond is a character who is a character of habit, both in fashion and in the accoutrements of life, in all spheres. He likes to eat the same things. He likes to drink the same things. He should be wearing the same watch. And at least in the Connery years, you saw the same watches recurring throughout his tenure. I feel like this, it set a standard for really how a Bond watch should be. It should just be a single iconic piece. And I don't think, as much as I actually prefer some of the watches of the Craig era as just like actual watches, I think the Brosnan era really represents a high watermark for what a Bond watch is. It's not just utilitarian, but it's also elegant. The idea of Bond wearing a Rolex and a dinner jacket was not really a thing as much as, the legend has built upon it in the Connery era. He's often wearing, with his dinner jacket, more of a Gruen dress watch, right, during those years. The iconic scene in Goldfinger where Bond is wearing the Rolex Submariner on the the NATO strap with the white dinner jacket was really just because he came out of out of a wetsuit when he changed over into his dinner jacket. It was a holdover from his diving equipment. It wasn't his standard choice of attire, but really, and you know, the Rolex does start to become part of Bond's like full-on everyday wear once you get to the first two Roger Moore movies. So it's not as though there wasn't precedent for this, but this image of Bond in a dinner jacket wearing the diving watch is a lot more seamless with the 1990s Rolex Submariner because of the detailing on that watch. It feels much more like a piece of jewelry, decoratively accented, than the Submariner, and thus feels appropriate to a 90s Bond who's a little bit more playful in his attire. And you know, it's interesting that even now, when Omega releases its celebratory Bond watch edition, as it did not long ago, it returns back to the kind of dial motif of the Brosnan era. There's a sense that even though Craig has worn so many Bond watches over the course of his tenure, the real Omega Bond watch icon is the Seamaster Professional. There's some sort of sense of that in the general consciousness that this is the watch. And because of the focused attention that watch gets across the Brosnan era, it's also almost much more of a showcase for a watch than stuff we've seen in the prior eras, outside of maybe the Rolex that really gets all the attention in Live and Let Die. I mean, there's no better Bond movie for showcasing a Bond watch than Live and Let Die and the Rolex. Now, when Daniel Craig comes in as Bond in Casino Royale, he sets this precedent of wearing multiple pieces in his movies. And unfortunately, I think they made a misstep by carrying over the Seamaster Professional from the Brosnan era. So there's this kind of awkward sense in Casino Royale, as much as that's one of the stronger Craig movies, I think, that he's kind of in some ways holding on to elements of the Brosnan era in a way that they probably should have made a clean break. He's introduced in the film wearing a Planet Ocean, which feels much more appropriate for where Craig's Bond is in the headspace of that movie. This kind of huge, brutal, forceful tool watch. It feels so tactical and bold and huge, and Craig's so bulked up in that movie that watch actually sits well on his wrist. I mean, it's such a bear of a wristwatch, but he can kind of pull it off in that movie. And the Planet Ocean has a tactical feel that feels much more appropriate to Craig's Bond. And it's a shame that the movie didn't quite embrace this transition from Seamaster Professional to Planet Ocean. I think there's a missed opportunity with the Craig era to really make the Planet Ocean the diving watch of the Daniel Craig Bond. They kind of keep jumping to other models throughout. He does wear the Planet Ocean in Quantum of Solace again. It's a slightly more reduced, more elegant model. He also wears it again in Skyfall alongside the watch that gets the bulk of the screen time, which is the Skyfall Aquaterra, which is a much more dressy watch. I think in those three films, you really see this kind of nice arc towards Bond's character kind of maturing into elegance by going from the Planet Ocean to the Aquaterra. So I almost could have loved this arc across the films if they had really committed to it, of Craig's Bond starting with the Planet Ocean and wearing the Planet Ocean in the kind of like Bond Begins movies of Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, and then kind of upgrading to the Skyfall Aquaterra for the rest of his tenure. I feel like that would have given us two really great iconic pieces for the Craig era, maybe with a different watch in No Time to Die. We'll talk about the No Time to Die watch because it's very interesting. But you kind of kept taking detours. As much as I think the Spectre SM300 is really, really stunning as a watch, I think it's kind of an odd fit for Bond. The NATO strap, I love the look, but I don't like the look in all the situations Daniel Craig's Bond is wearing it. It feels like it's too much of a stylish affectation for someone like Bond. I think, I don't know. It just doesn't feel like that is the watch Bond should be wearing with a suit, much less a dinner jacket. He looks a lot more at home, even with some of the, like with the Quantum of Solace Planet Ocean on his wrist when he's wearing his suit, to say nothing of the Aquaterra. I really wish that they had kept the SM300 on a bracelet. I think that would have just kind of sold the look, because it actually is, the SM300 on a bracelet is one of the dressier diving watches that Daniel Craig wears during his tenure. And you kind of get this sense that most of these watches feel like they're just Bond's own personal watches. He's not getting issued a lot of equipment in these movies. By the time you get to Spectre, it's the first time we see Bond get issued a watch as proper equipment. The exploding wristwatch. So there's kind of also a sense there that, yeah, that's not a watch Bond would naturally pick out for himself per se, but it you know, you still want that watch to kind of align with Bond's personality, much as the Brosnan Seamaster Professional was Q Branch issued equipment, but it just kind of seamlessly fit with the image of Bond established there. And then in the final film of the Craig tenure, you get one of the most interesting watches in the Bond series, because Bond's watch in No Time to Die is actually this curious design, because it's really meant to be an older issued watch from Bond's pre-MI6 career. It's clearly issued to him as like kind of a service watch, so to speak. And the sense is like when Bond retired, he kind of left the glamorous Omegas behind and is now wearing his old field-worn watch. That's why it's a little, the black has faded to brown from being worn in the sun for so long. It's kind of got this nice patina around it. I think the idea there is really cool. As a watch dork, I really wish that the watch had actually been more designed like the Omegas of the time that would have reflected Bond's career, like so like a mid to late 90s, you know, Omega model, as opposed to how it looks now. It looks very contemporary, but I respect this idea that this is really a very personal, sentimental watch for Bond in No Time to Die, and I think that's a really unique idea that the series has never done before. There is this sense of in Daniel Craig's Bond that we are really getting a sense of his like personal fashion choices in a way that you couldn't always be sure of with prior Bonds. And even in Spectre, we got a glimpse of him wearing what seemed to be a personal watch of his. In the tail end, when he's driving off with Madeline, he's wearing a vintage Omega chronograph, which I like in my own personal headcanon is like Bond's father's watch, you know, some sort of family heirloom that he's kept with him. And that really, in the sense of the character, it just kind of, I just wish they had settled on an icon for that era. As much as the watches all seem to relatively fit Craig's Bond very well, you don't get this sense of constancy with Craig's Bond, much as the Craig era seems to kind of jump around a bit from movie to movie. You get the sense that the watches are also kind of jumping around with each sort of pivot that they're making for each movie, instead of just kind of laying out the seamless, organic arc that you really might want from the Craig era. But the watches are beautiful, and it's hard to argue that the partnership with Omega hasn't been beneficial to Omega during the Craig years. I mean, so many really interesting models, both featured in the film and even some of the limited editions that were never featured in any Bond movie, have been big on both sides. And it kind of emphasizes, really, especially with the success of the No Time to Die Omega and its kind of cousin, which was like a hybrid anniversary release that took the No Time to Die mesh bracelet look and then mixed it with the 1990s Brosnan Seamaster professional vibes. There's just this sense that Omega and Bond now has a stronger association given the long-standing history they've had back since GoldenEye, really, that's quite a long period of time. That, in many ways, at least in my mind, the Omega is the Bond watch now. It's kind of, just by sheer force of consistency, overtaken all of its predecessors. And the Craig era, in many ways, was a celebration of Omega. There was just so many different, very cool models that just kind of celebrated that relationship. I hope now that as we look forward to Bond 26, that they really think about how to approach that. I think it's very likely we will see a return to something more like the classic, iconic Brosnan-era Seamaster Professional. I mean, I think fans would love it, and I also think it helps just, again, reinforce that model as being the other iconic model in the Omega catalog alongside the Moonwatch. But I also hope that they are really thoughtful about the way in which this watch reflects the next version of Bond. Regardless of which direction they go in, there's a lot of different ways in which that watch could reflect Bond. Personally, I like Bond. I would love it if Bond really kind of went back to a non-diving watch. I mean, something like the original Ian Fleming Rolex Explorer, which Omega has some good alternatives to in its Aquaterra line, or I think just recently discontinued Railmaster line. The Railmaster line I love to pieces, and I think that would have been an interesting choice for Bond in one of these movies, and might have actually kept that line alive had it gotten some Bond attention. But something in that design family, I think, would be a great blend of like tactical versatility as well as dressy elegance. But we'll have to see what Omega brings in Bond 26 whenever it does arrive. And when it does, I'll be there poring over the screenshots as soon as that watch is announced. So I hope you've enjoyed this two-part series. Certainly I've enjoyed talking about watches as long as I have. This is a big hobby of mine, so feel free to engage with me in the comments on any number of topics related to Bond watches. I'm happy to go back and forth with you all. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.